So you guys know that infamous cutscene where Neon is talking about how she wanted to become Chaos because she believed Chaos was a fairy tale, and her entire goal was the same as Jack's, to come and kill Chaos. And Jack doesn't like that answer, so he just says bullshit and starts blaring Limp Bizkit on his phone, and he walks away, right? I have dissected that cutscene down to the millisecond, you guys. I have gotten so much information about the nuances of everything. So, like, here's a good example, right? Jack is standing there with his, like, AirPods in, and he's essentially just probably not even listening to anything Neon's saying anyway. So he interrupts her, says bullshit, and dramatically turns on a song on his phone and walks away. Now, at first, everyone thought that was funny because it's like, oh yeah, he's just blaring music and he's walking away on his phone and everyone has to listen to it on the trek back. But no, he has the earphones in. So it's like, no one else can hear what he's doing. So he essentially just makes an ass of himself and goes on this really long trek without anyone hearing what is going on in his head. So that's thing number one, right? Number two, so people were debating on whether or not, like, with the initial cutscene, if Jack had played the song on a loop all the way to the very beginning of the dungeon where he walked out and turned his phone back off, or like if, you know, they just teleported him there and he turned his phone off and he's like, okay, because the song just progresses from the point that it was at before. So either it was on a loop or it was a really short walk. Here's the thing, right? From the first demo that we got to this game's release, they changed the cutscene.
Bullshit. He's out there. I can feel.
They changed the cutscene to validify people's belief that he was just playing this song on a loop. In the first cutscene, Jack takes the phone and just presses a button and he stands there and he's like, oh, I can feel chaos. In the new version of the cutscene, he takes his AirPods out of his ears midway through the song and tells everyone. They changed a really minor detail to, one, reinforce the fact that Jack was the only one who could hear the song, and two, to also reinforce the fact that he was listening to that shit on a loop throughout the entire dungeon. And you know what the saddest thing is? That is the most care and effort they put into anything in this story. So, I recently beat this little game called Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. And to be fully honest with you guys, this game kind of baffles me. I did not like the experience at all. I'm going to start with that one simple statement. And initially, I was going to make this huge essay-like review, cataloging my experience with the game, how I disliked the combat, how the story was obtuse and idiotic, how the gameplay progression and the world building just felt so empty and devoid of meaning in my initial playthrough. But as I sat down and I was typing words on the page, I realized that this game is something to be experienced, something to be felt, not to be told. And because of that, it's very difficult to sit down and spout words on a page and tell you how I felt. So I think it's better that I show you how I felt. I'm going to give you this quick little unscripted review of Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise Origin, whatever the hell it's called. Let's start off with the first thing that jumped to mind with Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise. It was 100% the goofy as hell presentation. So from the initial trailers and just general showcase and reveals from E3 that we had received regarding Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise, this game kind of seemed like a meme, and in all honesty, I was all for it. I love a good shitpost, a good meme, some stupidness, and 100% Jack Garland and this entire world seemed to just resonate direction that didn't really seem to care about story. Jack essentially being a skip cutscene button.
I'm a dark elf, you see. And we dark elves...
Just tell us about the crystals That's all I want to know.
Hey. You might not like this, but you know I like to speak my mind.
Let's go.
No.
Looks like you have the run of the town now.
Aye, that's the world we live in, where people have to turn to pirates for guidance. Pure chaos, if you ask me. Chaos, savvy?
Just tell us where the crystals are.
Harvests are bountiful, and from sun to sea, people sing the praises of the earth. A foolish dream, no matter how much you wish it, that season will never come. It will remain a dream so long as I live. Who I am.
I don't give a fuck!
It's fucking gorilla. This literal fucking gorilla, bro. He straight up he just walks around punching things, saying he doesn't care. He just wants to kill chaos, fight chaos, 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 chaos. That was literally what the whole entire marketing of the game was around. And I was fully expecting being thrown into this world with, just a meme, with just a joke, with just a parody of all of the stupid tropes that the Final Fantasy series and JRPGs in general have been portraying and dumping onto us for decades now. And what I got instead was this disgusting hodgepodge of that and then an actual story that's so poorly woven together that it felt like they didn't even try to deliver some semblance of actual nuance. The problem with the story to me was that they really tried to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to make a joke, but at the same time they wanted to actually present some sort of impact onto the Final Fantasy mythos by essentially retconning the entire first game. Now, I'm jumping ahead a bit on that, but my point in saying this is the story is set up very similarly to Neo's story. If you guys have played Neo 1 or 2, specifically Neo 2, there's random time skips. Nothing contextually about the world or the characters is ever portrayed to us. We never really get any semblance of understanding what the world inhabits, what our characters' goals are, who they are as people, and what the overall conflict is, aside from Jack just wanting to kill chaos. And that kind of turns this into a bit of a disaster, in all honesty. Because you go from the first 40 to 50% of the game, or up until maybe the last 5 or 6 story missions, just going around beating the shit out of monsters, Jack just saying, I don't care, I don't want to hear it, I just want to kill chaos. And then in the last 5 or 6 missions, they try to piece together some sort of actual story that doesn't really exist. And that causes a lot of misguided, directionless, aimless, just lack of story. It's a lack of honest story. And in all honesty, I could not give a shit about any of these characters. None of them at all. I couldn't give a shit about the guy who looks like Prompto. I can't even remember his name. I couldn't give a shit about Ash. I couldn't give a shit about Neon, or I don't even remember the last person's name. That's how bad it was story-wise. I can't even remember half of these characters' names, let alone tell you their significance to the story or what impact they actually had on anything going on in the events of the game. And I mean, not every game has to have that, right? But why would you include these characters, give them lines, personalities, connect them to Jack in the main story if you weren't going to have them do anything, if you weren't going to make them impactful regardless of any context? They could be jokes, they could be memes, they could be actual characters, they could be anything, but they're just there and they don't ever really do anything. It's Jack who mostly does everything. Yeah, I guess the biggest thing is that this game tries to be a meme at first, but then eventually morphs itself into an actual story. This game tries to essentially turn Jack into Garland from the original Final Fantasy, and they throw together that he's the Dark Lord, all this and that. He is chaos all the way at the very end of the game, and it definitely just felt like they wanted this big twist, but they didn't know how to actually build to it or create it, and they just dumped it at the very tail end, like completely devoid of any context. And it was just ridiculous and funny to me, because again, Jack goes around punching things while they're mid-monologue, explaining themselves, explaining the world, and then at the end of the game, he's just kind of like laughing about the fact that, oh yeah, I don't know what's going on. It's like, yeah, it's because you chose to not know what's going on. On that note with Jack too, he is simultaneously the worst and best protagonist in the Final Fantasy series. There's no other way I can really put that. He is so fucking ridiculous that my friends and I have affectionately referred to him as a mentally handicapped gorilla. His development as a character is hurriedly rushed into the last few moments of the story, where literally all of his dialogue, his entire purpose and origin as a character, and everything about his very nature is crammed into the last 3 chapters of the game. He spends a good 80% of the game grunting over story exposition. It's really difficult for me to not root for Jack when I'm also saying, fuck this low effort story, fuck these characters I don't give a shit about, fuck everything this game tried to piece together in a lazy, half-assed attempt at revising the Final Fantasy story. I just wanted to beat the shit out of some monsters and move on, and so did he. And in some ways, when I played Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise, I became Jack Garland, screaming in wild abandon at every brutal, visceral kill animation, cheering and cackling every time Jack opened his mouth just to tell another character to shut the fuck up. He literally punches a boss in the face and says, "I don't give a fuck who you are," mid-monologue. I don't think I've ever seen a main character do something so nonsensical and brain dead. On the note of nonsensical and brain dead, this game's soundtrack choices are fucking hilarious, and I don't understand them at all. So I've clowned on this meme for months now of Jack pulling up his iPhone with his AirPods in while Neon's explaining some story bits, and he goes, "This is bullshit," and just presses on his phone and then starts blaring, I don't know, something sounds like Limp Bizkit on his phone. And I thought, man, someone at Square Enix really likes new metal. These characters, these main characters, like Jack and Ash and Prompto Jr., they look like they're straight ripped out of a 2000s new metal band, like they're Breaking Benjamin or something. And my full thoughts were man, someone really likes that direction. I wonder if they're gonna actually throw that music into the cutscenes, into fights, but it as background music. It would be pretty funny to me. I would actually have enjoyed that. But no, they don't really do that. Most of the soundtrack is orchestral, and it's kind of a little boring in that regard. But there's one musical choice at the very end of the game that had me dying, and I don't understand why they chose it. I didn't realize it was in one of the promotional trailers too until I beat the game. But they have Frank Sinatra's rendition of My Way in the very final moments of the game, and that is so unfitting considering everything that transpires in the game. It's a very minor thing, but it's just such a it's so representative of the complete misguided hodgepodge that is this game, that they go from weird obscure new metal stuff to Frank Sinatra. I don't understand it at all. In any case, let's jump into a discussion about the combat real quick. Combat. So I heavily dislike combat and gameplay in this game a lot. Now, initially when I played the first few demos, I really liked the combat. I thought it was refreshing and unique to have the Final Fantasy magic system mixed in with Neo-esque gameplay with Dark Souls action RPG gameplay. And there were certain builds that seemed better than others, and it seemed like things were shaping up to at least be functional. But in a full-fledged RPG experience, this combat was heavily just lacking in actual substance and structure. I could not create a decent build with armor, and I could not create a decent build with a character tree. Once I maxed out a character tree that I thought was really good, like the Paladin class, or like, you know, the Sage class, or Red Mage or anything, I really didn't find any need to go back and start doing other classes, even to unlock, you know, different classes, different expert level classes later on. Once I kind of figured out what worked for me, it was very rare that I wanted to go off the beaten path and try something else, you know? And that was one minor issue, right? There was no need for me to start over, especially when the game, you know, penalized me for later in the game for using lower level classes, for using lower rank classes and trying to level them up separately. It just didn't really feel like, you know, meaningful to do so. So that was one issue. Another issue, I could not find an equipment build that worked because everything is scaled to the level of the equipment. So what that means is, like, I can pick up equipment that has affinity with the class I have, Sage, right? And if you get like 400% affinity bonus with Sage, you get like this ability that completely allows you to regenerate magic while also drinking potions. Or when you're Paladin, it means you don't take any damage from status effects, stuff like that. Like really good abilities and things you want to actually create a build for. But you won't find affinity attached gear with your class very often. It's all randomly generated, nor will you find enough to reach like that 400% from random drops on the ground. You have to like go back and do chaos level missions post game. So it's essentially impossible for you to find gear that matches with your class, that gives you the best stat rollouts possible without also making you extremely squishy and making it so that every enemy hits you once and you lose all of your MP. That's another issue of like the way the game is built. The poise meter, like being broken in this game, causes you to lose MP buildup, and getting MP buildup is done by breaking enemies themselves, breaking their poise meter and doing visceral animations on them. And that's problematic when you don't have a class that's good at breaking certain monsters. That's why magic builds were very good, is because you had different elements to break monsters easily. Or, you know, if you're using like a big great axe and you have one of those stupid abilities that breaks easily, or if you're using the hammer on like Sage or something and you have the earthquake ability, that one is busted. That just like literally broke the entire game for me. If you're not equipping the most recent highest level gear, even if say that all that gear has different affinity bonuses with different classes that you're not using, then an enemy can hit you once and you will break all of your poise and get staggered, and boss fights could become impossible. If you're not using the highest level weapon with your class possible, regardless of if it has the ability you like, regardless of if it has an affinity bonus that matches up with your class, you cannot do enough damage to that enemy at all. It's pretty much useless. And anytime you get your poise broken, anytime you get staggered, you lose your MP, which means it's harder to use your special abilities, because your special abilities use your MP, and it's hard to use your magic spells. When you die to a boss once or twice, you start to get reverse snowballed by them. The second you get staggered and you mess up once, the fight becomes insurmountably more difficult. But if you do it perfectly, it's a breeze. And there's really no there's no reward for actually having nuanced thought in this game, for doing things in a calculated manner, for building your character the way you want to build your character. You can't do that. You just have to go into the menu, hit the optimize equipment button, which gives you all the highest level gear right away, and then jump into a fight, and that's the most efficient way to beat the game. And that's not really a good way to design the game, to focus it around gear levels and not character builds, because it causes that complete disconnect. Like the loot system should have been drastically different. You shouldn't be just getting dropped random pieces of gear 24/7 and then expected to either sort through all of them, sell a bunch of them in bulk, or, you know, like just go through and hit the optimize button and get random pieces of gear. Like the gear should be more meaningful than that. on top of that, your abilities and your class layout should be more meaningful than just pressing an optimize button and going down a skill tree to get to one ability that you really like, and that seemed to be like the biggest problem with this game's combat overall, is that it did not reward people actually putting their time into creating nuanced builds and to creating a decent playing experience in the first playthrough. Now, I can't speak for if you were to do, the chaos difficulty at the post game after beating the game, going back and doing more difficult versions of missions. I can't speak on that. I'm sure it's much different that way, but the initial playthrough should be indicative of the experience going forward. You should be building upon that experience in your first initial playthrough. You shouldn't have to go back and redo everything. It should just be that you jump in and you gradually progress your character in the first playthrough, going through it initially, and then building upon that progression you had in your first playthrough once you beat the game afterwards. Yeah, you guys, this game was a bit of a disaster. I don't want to ever look at it or touch it again. And there were so many moments, cringeworthy moments, that I just could not stand. It's funny because I can't say that I hated every bit of it, because I loved when Jack would do something stupid. It would make me laugh, but like that was offset by boss fights that were ridiculously like either easy or ridiculously stupid and unfair because I couldn't play it the way I wanted to play it. Or there were just moments where the game felt unfocused, where I felt like I had to play it the way the game wanted me to play it and move on. I had that issue with the game with Sekiro Shadows Die Twice at one point, where it was like, not necessarily that the game was hard, but the game wanted you to parry. It wanted you to play the game a very specific way. And this game wants you to play a very specific way. They want you to do viscerals on every enemy. They don't want you to just kill enemies. They want you to parry every single attack that you can. And they want you to create a build around certain things. And like that makes some classes worse than others, because some classes are easier at breaking than others. Some classes have different, effects on monsters than others do. That makes it difficult to kind of play the game the way you would want to play it. Especially with how the gear system works too, but I've already talked in depth about that. And then there were just like moments that were just in poor taste. Like the moment where Jack punches the princess in the stomach.
I've never been struck by anyone before.
I had no other choice.
And then she wakes up and she's like, oh, I've never had anyone punch me before. Like she's turned on by it or some shit. Like that was like really gross and weird. I don't understand what they were doing promoting domestic abuse like that. But that was just, that was a yikes kind of moment, Then there was just like the complete like detachment I felt from emotional moments, like when Jack is killing all of his friends. It's like, okay, I didn't care about you guys anyway, and Jack didn't really care about you guys anyway. And then like they tried to piece together the whole, oh, everyone has to regain their memories and they're strangers, and they come from this other universe essentially, and they're dropped in here. Like it just didn't really feel like they gave a shit. The story felt low effort, the combat felt low effort, and it felt like they did not give it enough time to bake in the oven. But regardless, I beat it. Never gonna play it again, and in my honest recommendation, you guys should not touch this game. Do not touch Final Fantasy Origin, Stranger of Paradise. It is not worth your time.